Those medals look like you bought them at a garage sale." The words cut through the stale courtroom air like a blade, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had long ago stopped seeing defendants as human beings. Judge Constance Whitmore leaned forward on her bench, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, her lip curled in undisguised contempt. "Take them off. This is a court of law, not a costume parade." The man standing before her did not flinch. He was 71 years old, though the years had carved themselves so deeply into his face that he might have been older. His frame was gaunt beneath a threadbare suit jacket that hung from his shoulders like it had been made for someone else entirely. Beneath the jacket, a faded flannel shirt missing 2 buttons. His boots were held together with electrical tape, wrapped so many times it had become structural, and pinned to his chest, a row of military ribbons so faded they had lost most of their original color. Elias Thorne stood with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his posture straight despite everything. His eyes, the color of winter sky over frozen ground, remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge. He had learned decades ago how to absorb punishment without showing pain. This was nothing compared to what he had survived. The courtroom was small and suffocating. One of those municipal chambers where the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered and the air conditioning rattled like it was fighting a losing battle against its own machinery. Dark wood paneling absorbed what little light existed. The benches were worn smooth by generations of defendants who had sat waiting for their names to be called, waiting for judgment to be passed, waiting for their lives to be weighed and found wanting. In the gallery, a sparse collection of observers waited their own turns before the court. A young woman with a laptop balanced on her knees typed notes intermittently. Nina Castellanos, freelance journalist, here to cover a different case entirely, but finding herself unable to look away from the old man being publicly humiliated. Her phone rested beside her, camera app already open. Something about this felt wrong in a way she could not yet articulate. Near the door, Bailiff Theodore Saunders stood with his arms crossed over his chest. 58 years old, retired Army Master Sergeant, 12 years working security in this courthouse. He had seen Judge Whitmore tear into defendants before. She was hard on everyone, but she reserved a particular venom for the homeless and an even sharper edge for those who claimed military service. Too many fakers, she always said. Too many men trying to game the system with stories they had stolen from better people. But something about this defendant made Saunders uncomfortable. It was the way he stood. Most men in his position would slouch, would make themselves smaller, would radiate the defeat that came from sleeping rough and eating from dumpsters. This man stood at parade, rest without seeming to realize it. His weight was distributed evenly, his spine straight, his chin level. It was muscle memory, the kind that took years to develop and could never be fully unlearned. "With respect, Your Honor," the old man said, his voice soft but steady, barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the room. "I would prefer not to remove them." Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. She had been on this bench for 24 years. She had seen every manipulation, every performance, every attempt to invoke sympathy through false claims of service. This man was no different. He was just another vagrant who had probably found those ribbons in a donation bin somewhere and pinned them on hoping for leniency. "You would prefer?" she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. The defendant would prefer. She turned to the prosecutor, a tired-looking woman named Allison Graves who clearly wanted this case over with. "What are the charges again?" "Trespassing, Your Honor." The defendant was found sleeping in an abandoned equipment shed on a construction site off Miller Road. The public defender, a young man named Marcus Webb who had been assigned this case approximately 40 minutes before it was called, shuffled through papers he had barely had time to read. "Your Honor, my client has no prior record in this jurisdiction. He poses no flight risk. We request leniency given his circumstances and his claimed military service." "Claimed service," Judge Whitmore repeated. She fixed her gaze back on Elias. "That is the operative word. Claimed, because I have seen 100 men exactly like you standing exactly where you are standing right now. Men who put on medals they never earned, who tell stories they never lived, who expect special treatment for sacrifices they never made. Now, if you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. Because hidden heroes like the man standing in this courtroom exist in every community. Maybe even yours. Someone whose humble appearance conceals an extraordinary story of service and sacrifice. Someone invisible to everyone who passes them on the street. Please consider subscribing to our channel if stories like this one about courage and second chances speak to you. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. Elias remained silent as the judge continued her tirade. His eyes dropped briefly to his own chest, to the faded ribbons that had been pinned and unpinned from a dozen different jackets over 4 decades. The Distinguished Service Cross ribbon had faded from its original blue to something closer to gray. The silver star clusters had lost their shine years ago. The Purple Heart ribbons were fraying at the edges. They did not look impressive. He knew that. They looked like exactly what the judge accused them of being. Costume pieces. Props. Lies made tangible. But they were not lies. Every thread, every faded color, every worn edge represented something real. Blood spilled. Brothers lost. Nights spent in places whose names he was still not permitted to speak aloud. "I am ordering you," Judge Whitmore said, her voice rising, "to remove those ribbons from your jacket immediately, or I will hold you in contempt and add 30 days to whatever sentence I am about to impose." The courtroom went quiet. Even the rattling air conditioner seemed to pause. Bailiff Saunders took an unconscious step forward. He had noticed something when the old man shifted his weight. The sleeve of that threadbare jacket had ridden up just slightly, revealing the edge of something on his inner forearm. Dark ink. Old ink. The kind of tattoo that came from military service, not a street parlor. Saunders had spent 8 years at Fort Bragg before his Gulf War deployment. He had seen tattoos like that before. Unit designations. Coordinates. Memorial marks for the fallen. His heart began to beat faster. Elias Thorne slowly reached up and began to unpin the ribbons from his chest. His hands did not shake. His expression did not change. He removed them one by one and held them in his weathered palm, looking down at them like they were pieces of his own soul he was being forced to surrender. But what Judge Constance Whitmore did not know, what no one in that suffocating courtroom yet understood, was that in exactly 43 minutes, a 2-star general would walk through those doors. And when she did, everything would change. The video being recorded on Nina Castellanos' phone would be viewed 40 million times. The judge's career would effectively end. And the truth about the man standing silent and humiliated before her bench would finally come to light. Because some ribbons are not bought at garage sales. Some ribbons are earned in blood and fire and sacrifice. And the man holding them in his palm had earned more than almost anyone alive. The ribbons felt weightless in his palm. Strange, Elias thought, how something so small could carry the weight of so many lives. He closed his fingers around them gently, the way he might hold a wounded bird, and lowered his hand to his side. Judge Whitmore was speaking again, her voice a drone of legal terminology and thinly veiled contempt, but Elias had stopped listening. His mind had drifted backward through the decades, pulled by currents he could never fully control. It happened sometimes. A smell, a sound, a particular quality of light. And suddenly he was 19 years old again, standing at the recruiting office in Harrisburg with his father's words still ringing in his ears. "You walk out that door," his father had said, "you are walking away from everything I built. The hardware store, the family name, all of it." Elias had walked out anyway. Not because he did not love his father. He did. But there was something inside him that the hardware store could never touch, a hunger for purpose that small-town Pennsylvania could never feed. He needed to know what he was capable of. He needed to be tested. The Army tested him. Fort Benning first, then airborne school, then ranger selection. Each time they told him he would fail, and each time he proved them wrong. Not through strength alone, though he had that. Through something quieter, an ability to endure. to keep moving forward when every nerve screamed for him to stop. In 1978, he was selected for Delta Force, one of the original operators, back when the unit was still more concept than reality. Colonel Beckwith himself had looked Elias in the eye and told him that he was either going to be one of the best soldiers America had ever produced, or he was going to die trying to become one. Elias had not died, though there were days, especially recently, when he wished he had. The courtroom pulled him back to the present. Judge Whitmore was asking him something, her voice sharp with impatience. "I asked if you have anything to say for yourself," she repeated. "Any explanation for why you were trespassing on private property?" Elias looked up at her. For a moment, their eyes met, and something flickered across the judge's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or recognition of something she could not quite name. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual expression of disdain. "I was cold, Your Honor," Elias said quietly. "I was just looking for somewhere warm to sleep." The judge's lip curled. "Cold," she repeated. "You were cold, and that gives you the right to break into private property." The shed was abandoned. The door was already open. "I did not break anything." "Irrelevant. The property belongs to someone. You do not have the right to simply take shelter wherever you please, because you have chosen to live on the streets." Chosen. The word landed like a blow, though Elias did not show it. As if anyone chose this. As if he had woken up one morning and decided that sleeping under bridges and eating from garbage cans sounded preferable to the life he had built. But in a way, the judge was right. He had chosen this. Not the homelessness itself, but the path that led to it. He had chosen to leave, to disappear, to walk away from everyone who might have helped him because he could not bear the weight of their kindness. Marie would have been furious with him. Even now, 3 years after her death, he could hear her voice clear as morning. "Elias James Thorne," she would say, using his full name the way she always did when she was angry. "You stubborn fool. You do not get to give up. You do not get to run away from people who love you." But Marie was gone. The cancer had taken her piece by piece over 18 months, and Elias had watched helplessly as the woman who had been his anchor for 30 years faded into someone he barely recognized. At the end, she weighed less than 90 pounds. Her hand in his felt like paper, like it might crumble if he held too tight. Her last words to him had been simple. "Keep living, Eli. Promise me." He had promised, but he had not kept that promise. Not really. After the funeral, he had stayed in their house for 3 weeks, surrounded by her things, her smell still on the pillows, her voice still echoing in every room. And then one night, he simply could not bear it anymore. He packed a single bag, walked out the front door, and never went back. That was 3 years ago. He had not spoken to anyone from his old life since. Had not contacted the army, had not reached out to the few friends who remained, had not done anything except survive. And even that felt like too much most days. Bailiff Saunders was watching him from across the courtroom. Elias could feel the weight of his gaze, the questions forming behind his eyes. The bailiff had noticed something. Elias could tell by the way he had stepped forward, by the way his attention had sharpened. It was the tattoo, probably. Elias had gotten careless, letting his sleeve ride up. The ink on his inner forearm was old and faded, but still legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Coordinates in degrees and minutes. A date. The Delta Force emblem, stylized and small. And beneath it all, 2 initials, D8 Desmond Achebe. His spotter. His best friend. The man who had died in his arms in a dusty room halfway around the world because Elias had been half a second too slow. The memory came unbidden, as it always did. The muzzle flash from the ceiling. Desmond falling. The wet heat of blood soaking through Elias's fatigues as he cradled his friend, screaming for a medic who would arrive too late. And Desmond's voice, somehow calm even as his life drained away, saying the words that had haunted Elias every day since. "You got the shot. You always get the shot. Go home to Marie." But Elias had not gotten a shot. Not that time. And Desmond had paid for his failure with his life. Judge Whitmore was lecturing again, something about personal responsibility and the burden that homeless individuals placed on society. Elias heard the words, but they washed over him without impact. He had been lectured by drill sergeants who could make this woman seem like a kindergarten teacher. He had been screamed at by men whose voices could strip paint from walls. Nothing she said could touch the places where he truly lived. What had touched him, what always touched him, was the weight of the dog tags around his neck. 2 sets. His own, worn smooth by decades against his skin, and Desmond's, given to him by Desmond's mother at the funeral, pressed into his hands with trembling fingers. "You wear these," she had said, her accent thick with the Nigerian cadences she had never lost despite 40 years in America. "You wear these, and you keep my boy close. As long as you wear them, part of him is still serving. Part of him is still alive." Elias had not removed them since. Not once in 33 years. They hung against his chest with Marie's wedding ring on the same chain. 3 pieces of gold and steel that represented everyone he had loved and lost. And now, this judge, this woman who knew nothing of sacrifice, nothing of loss, nothing of the price that service demanded, wanted him to remove them. The irony was not lost on him. He had survived firefights in Grenada, hostage rescues in the Middle East, operations in countries whose names were still classified. He had been shot twice, had taken shrapnel to his shoulder and his thigh, had watched friends die in ways that no human being should ever have to witness. And now he stood in a courtroom being told that his service was a lie by a woman who had never risked anything more dangerous than a paper cut. He could have defended himself. He could have recited his service record, named operations, provided details that would leave no doubt. But what would be the point? People like Judge Whitmore did not want to be convinced. They wanted to be right, and nothing he said would change her mind. So he remained silent, the ribbons still clutched in his hand, and waited for whatever came next. Judge Whitmore straightened in her chair, a predator sensing weakness in wounded prey. She had broken defendants before with nothing more than silence and the weight of her authority, but this one refused to break. His quiet dignity irritated her in a way she could not fully explain. It felt like defiance, and defiance in her courtroom was something she could not tolerate. "Approach the bench," she commanded. "Bring those ribbons with you." The prosecutor, Allison Graves, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The charges are simple trespassing. I am not sure what relevance the defendant's medals have to the proceedings." "They have relevance because I say they have relevance." Judge Whitmore did not take her eyes off Elias. "I want to examine them myself. If this man is going to stand in my courtroom wearing symbols of military service, I want to see exactly what he claims to have earned." Public Defender Marcus Webb rose halfway from his chair. "Your Honor, I must object. This borders on harassment of my client." Objection noted and overruled. "Sit down, counselor." Webb sat. He was 29 years old, idealistic, and utterly outmatched. He had taken this job because he believed in justice, believed that everyone deserved representation regardless of their circumstances. But days like this one made him wonder if justice was anything more than a word people use to make themselves feel better about systems designed to grind the powerless into dust. Elias walked forward. His gait was measured and precise, each step placed with deliberate care. Bailiff Saunders watched him move and felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. That was not the walk of a homeless man. That was the walk of someone trained to cross hostile ground without making sound, someone whose body had been honed into an instrument of purpose. Saunders had seen that walk before in the special operations soldiers who occasionally passed through Fort Bragg, men who moved like ghosts even in broad daylight. Elias stopped before the bench and held out his palm. The ribbons lay there like fallen leaves, faded and fragile. Judge Whitmore leaned forward and plucked them up one by one, examining each with theatrical scrutiny. "Distinguished Service Cross," she read aloud, her voice dripping with skepticism. "That is the second highest military decoration for valor, is it not? Just below the Medal of Honor." "Yes, Your Honor. And you expect me to believe that a man sleeping in abandoned sheds earned the Distinguished Service Cross?" "I do not expect anything, Your Honor. I am simply telling you the truth." The judge held the ribbon up to the light, squinting at it as though she might find made in China stamped on the back. The fabric was worn almost translucent in places, the colors so faded they were barely distinguishable. It looked old. It looked authentic. And that only made her angrier, because it threatened the narrative she had already constructed in her mind. She moved to the next ribbon. Silver Star. 2 of them, in fact. Also for valor. She looked at Elias with open contempt. You must have been quite the hero. I was a soldier, Your Honor. Nothing more. And these purple hearts. 2 of those as well. Where exactly were you wounded? Elias paused. The memories pressed against the walls he had built around them, demanding release. His shoulder throbbed with phantom pain, the way it always did when the weather changed, or when someone forced him to remember. Grenada in 1983, he said quietly. Shrapnel to my left shoulder during an airfield assault. And again in 1991, during a hostage rescue operation. Bullet grazed to my right thigh. Judge Whitmore snorted. Convenient. 2 famous operations, both well documented. Anyone with internet access could claim the same. In the gallery, Nina Castellanos had stopped typing notes on her laptop. Her phone was in her hand now, camera recording, capturing every word. She did not know why she was doing it. Instinct, maybe, the sense that she was witnessing something that mattered, even if she could not yet understand what. Bailiff Saunders took another step closer, positioning himself where he could see the defendant clearly. The old man's sleeve had ridden up further during his walk to the bench, and now Saunders could see the full tattoo on his inner forearm. His breath caught in his throat. Coordinates. Specific coordinates in degrees, minutes, and seconds. A date. March 15th, 1991. The Delta Force emblem, small but unmistakable. And below it, the initials DA surrounded by a simple wreath. Saunders knew those coordinates. Every soldier who had ever served at Fort Bragg knew those coordinates. They were etched into a memorial plaque outside the Special Operations Command building, marking the location of a classified hostage rescue operation that had gone sideways. The mission had succeeded, but at a cost. 1 operator killed. The details were still classified, but the legend had spread through the ranks like wildfire. The team leader on that mission had been called Spectre. He was one of the most decorated operators in Delta Force history, a man whose name was spoken with reverence by those who knew it and with awe by those who only knew the stories. He had retired sometime in the early 2000s and disappeared from public life entirely. Saunders looked at the old man standing before the judge, looked at the way he held himself, the quiet dignity in his bearing, the winter sky eyes that had seen things no human being should ever have to see. And suddenly, impossibly, the pieces began to fall into place. It could not be. It could not possibly be. But the tattoo did not lie. Coordinates did not lie. And the man standing before Judge Constance Whitmore, being mocked and humiliated and accused of stolen valor, was carrying evidence on his own skin that no garage sale could provide. These are reproductions, Judge Whitmore declared, tossing the ribbons back toward Elias with casual dismissal. Good quality reproductions, I will grant you that, but reproductions nonetheless. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied with her own judgment. I have seen enough. You will remove any remaining military insignia from your person immediately, or I will hold you in contempt. Elias caught the ribbons before they could fall to the floor. He looked down at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but something had changed in its timbre, a thread of steel beneath the softness. Your Honor, these ribbons have been pinned to 3 different jackets over 40 years. The medals themselves are in a storage unit I lost access to 18 months ago. I cannot afford the payments. These ribbons are what I have left of my service. They are what I have left of the men I served with. And with respect, I will not apologize for wearing them. Judge Whitmore's face flushed red. She was not accustomed to being contradicted. She was not accustomed to defendants who refused to cower. Then you leave me no choice, she said coldly. I am adding a contempt charge to your case. That is an additional 30 days in county jail on top of whatever sentence I impose for the trespassing. She gestured sharply towards Saunders. Bailiff, confiscate those ribbons as evidence of fraud. Saunders did not move. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the old man, his mind racing through decades of stories and legends and whispered names. "Bailiff," Judge Whitmore snapped. "I gave you an order." Saunders swallowed hard. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "I think we should wait." "Excuse me. I think we should wait before we do anything else. There is something about this man. Something that does not add up the way you think it does." The courtroom went silent. Even the rattling air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. Judge Whitmore stared at her bailiff as though he had grown a second head. In 12 years, Theodore Saunders had never once questioned her authority. He was reliable, quiet professional, the kind of man who followed orders without complaint and kept his opinions to himself. And now he stood in the middle of her courtroom, suggesting they wait, as though she were some junior associate who needed guidance. "Bailiff Saunders," she said, her voice ice and venom, "I do not recall asking for your assessment of the situation. I gave you a direct order. Confiscate those ribbons." Saunders did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Elias, on the tattoo visible beneath his sleeve, on the way the old man held himself with a stillness that spoke of decades of discipline. The coordinates inked into that weathered skin were seared into Saunders' memory now. He had walked past the memorial plaque bearing those same numbers 1,000 times during his years at Fort Bragg, had traced them with his fingers once on the anniversary of his own deployment, wondering about the men whose sacrifice they represented. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I served at Fort Bragg from 1988 to 1996. I was not special operations myself, just regular Army, but I knew people who were. I heard stories." "Stories," Judge Whitmore repeated flatly. "You're interrupting these proceedings because of stories." The coordinates on this man's arm. I recognize them. They match a memorial at Fort Bragg. For an operation that is still classified. An operation where one of our best operators was killed. In the gallery, Nina Castellanos leaned forward, her phone steady in her hand. The red recording light blinked silently. She had come to this courthouse expecting to cover a routine zoning dispute for a local news blog. Instead, she found herself documenting something she did not yet understand but knew instinctively was important. Elias stood motionless before the bench, the ribbon still clutched in his palm. He had not expected this, had not expected anyone to recognize the ink he carried, the permanent record of the worst day of his life. For 3 years he had moved through the world like a ghost, invisible and unremarkable, and now a bailiff in a municipal courtroom was pulling threads that could unravel everything. The memories rushed forward, breaking through the walls he had built. March 15th, 1991. The briefing room at Fort Bragg, fluorescent lights humming overhead, maps spread across tables showing a compound in a country he was still not permitted to name. Intelligence indicated 3 American contractors held by a malicious splinter group. Standard hostage rescue profile. In and out in under an hour, if everything went according to plan. Nothing went according to plan. Elias had been team leader. 8 operators under his command, the best of the best. Men who had trained together until they moved as a single organism. Desmond Achebe was his spotter, had been his spotter for 6 years by then. They communicated in glances and gestures, in the subtle language of men who had trusted each other with their lives so many times that words became unnecessary. The insertion went smooth. Helicopter drop 2 kilometers out. Silent approach through scrub brush and rocky terrain. The compound was exactly where intelligence said it would be, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by a crumbling wall. Guards posted at predictable intervals. Routines observed and cataloged over 72 hours of surveillance. Elias set up his overwatch position on a ridge 200 meters east. Desmond beside him, range cards prepared, wind calculations already running through his head. The rest of the team moved in, shadows against shadows, breaching the outer wall without a sound. Then the shooting started, not from the guards they had identified, from somewhere else. A secondary force they had not known about, militia reinforcements that intelligence had completely missed. Elias watched through his scope as his team scattered for cover, as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like malevolent fireflies. He took shot after shot, dropping targets as fast as he could acquire them. Desmond called adjustments, his voice calm even as chaos erupted below. For 11 minutes, they held the ridge, providing cover while the team fought their way to the hostages, while the extraction helicopter screamed toward their position. The hostages were secured. The team was pulling back. Elias allowed himself a single breath of relief. That was when he saw the shooter. A figure in an upper window of the main building, a window they had cleared twice during surveillance, a window that should have been empty. The man was raising an RPG launcher, aiming directly at the extraction point where 4 of Elias's operators were loading the hostages onto the helicopter. Elias swung his rifle, acquired the target, squeezed the trigger. Half a second too late. The RPG fired a fraction of a moment before his bullet found its mark. The shooter dropped, dead before he hit the ground, but the rocket was already in flight. It missed the helicopter by inches, close enough to scorch the paint, and detonated against the compound wall instead. Desmond had been moving, had seen the threat at the same moment Elias did, and had broken from cover to wave off the helicopter to give them a chance to evade. The wall exploded 10 feet from where he stood. Elias was running before the debris finished falling. Down the ridge, across open ground, heedless of the remaining gunfire. He found Desmond in the rubble, still alive, but barely. Shrapnel had torn through his vest, severed his femoral artery. Blood pumped from the wound in rhythmic spurts, too fast to stop, too much to survive. Elias held him, pressed his hands against the wound, even though he knew it was hopeless, even though he could feel the life draining out of his best friend with every heartbeat. Desmond looked up at him, and somehow, impossibly, he smiled. "You got the shot," he said. His voice was fading, the words coming slower with each breath. "You always get the shot. Go home to Marie." He died 90 seconds later. Elias held him for another 10 minutes, until the extraction team physically pulled him away. The mission was classified a success. All 3 hostages recovered. 7 of 8 operators returned home. Elias received another Silver Star, his second, for his actions during the firefight. He never wore it. He should have seen the shooter sooner. Should have checked that window a 3rd time. Should have been faster, better, more vigilant. Desmond was dead because Elias had failed, and no medal could change that. No commendation could bring him back. In the courtroom, Elias blinked and a memory receded, leaving him hollow and aching. Bailiff Saunders was still speaking, still trying to explain to Judge Whitmore why they should not dismiss this old man as a fraud. But Elias barely heard him. He was still in that compound, still holding Desmond, still feeling the warmth drain from his friend's body. The dog tags around his neck felt heavier than they had in years. Marie's ring pressed against his sternum, a cold circle of gold that reminded him of everything he had lost. He had promised her he would keep living. He had broken that promise the day he walked away from their empty house. And now he stood in a courtroom being accused of lying about the very service that had defined his entire existence. The irony was almost enough to make him laugh. Almost. Judge Whitmore had heard enough. She raised her hand, cutting off Bailiff Saunders mid-sentence. Her patience evaporated entirely. The gesture carried the weight of 24 years on the bench, 2 decades of absolute authority in this small domain where her word was law and her judgment was final. "I do not care what you think you recognize," she said coldly. "I do not care about stories from Fort Bragg or memorial plaques or any other nonsense you want to bring into my courtroom. What I care about is evidence. Documentation. Something verifiable." She fixed her gaze on Elias with the intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. "And so far, all I have seen is a homeless man in borrowed clothes wearing ribbons he cannot prove he earned." The words hung in the air like smoke. In the gallery, the other defendants waiting their turn shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, embarrassed to witness such naked cruelty. Others watched with the detached curiosity of people grateful they were not the one standing before the bench. Marcus Webb rose again, his young face flushed with frustration. "Your Honor, my client is not on trial for his military service. He is charged with trespassing, a misdemeanor. The relevance of his medals to these proceedings is questionable at best. The relevance, Judge Whitmore snapped, is that this man has attempted to manipulate this court by wearing symbols of service he did not earn. That speaks to character. That speaks to credibility. That speaks to whether anything he says can be trusted. She leaned forward, her reading glasses catching the fluorescent light. I have seen men like you before, she said directly to Elias. Men who put on uniforms they never wore, who tell stories they read in books, who expect special treatment for sacrifices that exist only in their imagination. It is an insult to every real veteran who served this country. Elias remained silent. His fingers had closed around the ribbons so tightly that the edges pressed into his palm, leaving marks that would linger for hours. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the judgment, the skepticism, the casual dismissal of everything he had given to a country that had apparently forgotten him. What could he say that would matter? He could recite operations, name coordinates, describe missions in detail that no civilian should ever know. But classified meant classified, even now, even after all these years. And even if he spoke, even if he laid bare every secret he had carried, this woman had already decided what she believed. Facts would not penetrate the armor of her certainty. Public Defender Webb tried once more. Your Honor, I move to have the contempt charge dismissed. My client has committed no fraud. He has made no false statements to this court. He simply declined to remove personal items that have deep meaning to him. Denied. Judge Whitmore did not even pause to consider the motion. Your client has been given multiple opportunities to comply with the court's instructions. His continued defiance leaves me no choice. She shuffled papers on her desk, preparing to deliver her ruling. The trespassing charge alone would have merited a fine, perhaps community service, perhaps a few days in county jail at most. But she intended to make an example of this man. She intended to send a message that stolen valor would not be tolerated in her courtroom. Elias, she said, her voice taking on the formal cadence of official pronouncement, on the charge of trespassing, I find you guilty. Given the circumstances of your arrest and your behavior in this courtroom, I am imposing a sentence of 60 days in county jail, suspended to 30 days, plus 100 hours of community service. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. On the charge of contempt of court, I am adding an additional 30 days. These sentences will run consecutively. 60 days, 2 months in a cell for the crime of seeking shelter from the cold, for the crime of wearing ribbons that told the truth about who he was. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, I am ordering that the items in question, these so-called medals, be confiscated as evidence of potential fraud. If investigation determines they are genuine, they will be returned. If not, additional charges may be filed. Your Honor, Bailiff Saunders stepped forward, his voice urgent. I strongly advise against this course of action. Judge Whitmore turned on him with fury in her eyes. One more word, bailiff, and you will be looking for new employment. Do I make myself clear? Saunders stopped, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. In 12 years, he had never defied this judge, had never risked his pension for a stranger, had never put himself on the line for anyone who walked through those courtroom doors. But something about this felt different. Something about this felt like a line he could not uncross. He thought about the memorial at Fort Bragg, the names etched in bronze, the coordinates that matched the ink on this old man's arm. He thought about the stories he had heard, whispered in barracks and repeated at veterans' gatherings, about an operator called Spectre who had done things that most soldiers could not imagine. And he thought about what it would mean if those stories were true. What would mean if the man standing before Judge Whitmore was exactly who he claimed to be. Near the courtroom door, Court Security Officer Dwayne Fletcher checked his radio as a message came through. A VIP had arrived at the courthouse, someone important enough to require an escort. He glanced at the proceedings, noted that nothing seemed to require his immediate attention, and slipped out to handle the request. He did not know that his departure would change everything. He did not know that the VIP waiting in the lobby was a 2-star general who had spent her entire career trying to live up to the standards set by a man she had trained under nearly 40 years ago. He did not know that in a matter of minutes, the case of a homeless trespasser would become national news. Judge Whitmore rapped her gavel. This matter is concluded. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody. Saunders did not move. Bailiff. Still nothing. Saunders stood rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on Elias, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. In the gallery, Nina Castellanos adjusted her phone, making sure she captured every angle. Her instincts were screaming now. Whatever was happening in this courtroom, it was not over. The tension in the air was electric, building towards something she could not yet see but could feel in her bones. Elias looked at the bailiff. For a long moment, their eyes met. Two soldiers, separated by decades and circumstance, recognizing something in each other that transcended words. Then Elias shook his head slightly. "It is all right," he said quietly. "Do your job. I have survived worse than this." The words hit Saunders like a physical blow, because he believed them. Looking at this man, at the scars visible on his hands and the weight of untold years in his eyes, Saunders believed every word. Saunders forced himself to move. Each step toward Elias felt like walking through deep water, resistance pushing against him from all sides. His hands trembled as he reached for the handcuffs on his belt, the metal cold against his fingers despite the warmth of the courtroom. Elias extended his wrists without being asked. The gesture was automatic, the compliance of a man who had spent a lifetime following orders, even when those orders made no sense. His eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the courtroom, beyond the flickering fluorescent lights, beyond the petty cruelties of a system that had forgotten him entirely. The handcuffs clicked shut. The sound echoed through the silent chamber like a gunshot. Judge Whitmore nodded with satisfaction. Finally, she muttered, "Some respect for the process." But Saunders was not finished. As he secured the restraints, he leaned close to Elias, close enough to speak without being overheard. His voice was barely a whisper, meant for one set of ears alone. "Spectre," he breathed. "That was your call sign, was it not?" Elias went rigid. For the first time since he had entered this courtroom, something cracked in his composure. His eyes snapped to Saunders' face, searching, evaluating, the instincts of 4 decades of covert operations suddenly alive and burning. "How do you know that name?" he said. The words were so quiet they barely existed. "I told you. I was at Bragg. I heard stories about an instructor who could shoot a target at 800 meters in a crosswind, about a man who went into places that did not exist and came back with people who were never officially missing. They called him Spectre because by the time you knew he was there, it was already over." Elias said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles stood out like cables beneath his weathered skin. "The tattoo on your arm," Saunders continued. "Those coordinates. I have seen them before. On the memorial outside Special Operations Command. March 15th, 1991. The mission where Corporal Achebe was killed. At the mention of Desmond's name, something shifted in Elias's eyes. The winter sky hardened into steel, into something cold and dangerous and utterly unbreakable. "You do not know what you are talking about," he said flatly. "Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong about all of it. But I do not think so. And I think before this goes any further, someone needs to verify exactly who you are." The judge's voice cut through their exchange like a blade. "Bailiff, is there a problem?" Saunders straightened. "No, Your Honor. Just securing the defendant. Then move it along. I have other cases to hear." Saunders gripped Elias's arm, more gently than procedure required, and began guiding him toward the side door that led to the holding cells. But his mind was racing, calculating options, searching for some way to delay the inevitable long enough for the truth to emerge. In the gallery, Nina Castellanos lowered her phone for just a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. She had captured everything. The judge's accusations, the old man's quiet dignity, the bailiff's strange hesitation. Something told her this footage was important. Something told her she should not delete a single frame. The other defendants watched in silence as Elias was led away. Some of them were veterans themselves, men who had served and struggled and found themselves on the wrong side of a system that promised to help them, but so often failed. They saw the ribbons still clutched in the old man's cuffed hands. They saw the way he walked, shoulders back, spine straight, even in defeat. One of them, a younger man with a Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm, stood up. The movement caught Judge Whitmore's attention immediately. "Sit down," she commanded. The young man did not sit. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone who had seen combat and come home changed. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I know what real service looks like, and I know what real medals look like. That man is not lying." I said, "Sit down. One more word, and you will join him in contempt." The Marine hesitated. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, every muscle in his body screaming to do something, to intervene, to stand up for a brother being torn apart by someone who had never sacrificed anything. But he had his own case to worry about, his own life hanging in the balance. And so after a long moment, he sank back onto the bench. But his words had done something. They had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of everyone watching. The stenographer, Dorothy Chun, had stopped typing entirely, her fingers frozen above the keys. The prosecutor, Allison Graves, was staring at her notes without seeing them, uncomfortable with the direction these proceedings had taken. Even the clerk at the side desk had paused in his work, watching the old man being led away with something like shame in his eyes. Judge Whitmore felt the shift in the room and did not like it. "Order," she snapped, though no one had spoken. "We will have order in this courtroom." The side door opened. Saunders guided Elias through, into the narrow hallway that connected the courtroom to the holding area. The door swung shut behind them, cutting off the judge's voice mid-sentence. For a moment, they stood in the dim corridor, the only sound the distant hum of the building's ancient HVAC system. "I meant what I said," Saunders told him. "I'm going to find out who you really are. And if you're who I think you are, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what happened in that courtroom today." Elias looked at him. The steel in his eyes had softened slightly, replaced by something that might have been gratitude or might have been exhaustion. "It does not matter," he said quietly. "None of it matters anymore. Desmond is still dead. Marie is still gone. Knowing who I was will not change any of that. Maybe not, but it might change what happens next." They stood there for a long moment, 2 soldiers from different eras, connected by a thread of recognition that transcended rank and time and circumstance. Then the door at the far end of the hallway opened, and Court Security Officer Fletcher appeared. Behind him, silhouetted against the bright lights of the main corridor, stood a woman in army dress uniform. 2 silver stars gleamed on her shoulders. "Saunders," Fletcher called out, "you need to come back to the courtroom. There is someone here who wants to see what is going on." The woman stepped forward into the light. Her face was angular and sharp, her posture perfect, her gaze sweeping the hallway with a practiced assessment of someone accustomed to command. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver streaking her dark hair, and she moved with the quiet confidence of a person who had earned every ounce of authority she possessed. Her eyes found Elias, found the handcuffs on his wrists, the ribbons clutched in his fingers, the threadbare jacket hanging from his gaunt frame. And Major General Rebecca Huang went absolutely still. The hallway seemed to contract around them, the walls pressing inward as the moment stretched into something vast and impossible. General Huang stood frozen at the far end of the corridor, her eyes locked on the old man in handcuffs, her mind refusing to accept what she was seeing. She had been 23 years old in 1987, fresh out of West Point, assigned to Fort Bragg for specialized training, utterly convinced that she had made a terrible mistake in choosing the Army. The other officers in her cohort were confident, aggressive, certain of their place in the world. She was none of those things. She was a second-generation immigrant, the daughter of parents who had fled Taiwan with nothing, and every day she felt like an imposter wearing a uniform she had not earned. Her first week at Bragg, she had considered resigning her commission, had drafted the letter 3 times, each version more apologetic than the last. She would return to civilian life, find some quiet job that did not demand so much except that she was not cut out for leadership. Then Master Sergeant Elias Thorne had taken her unit through a training exercise that changed everything. It was a simple scenario on paper. Navigate hostile territory, locate a target, extract without being detected. The kind of exercise that special operations candidates ran through dozens of times. But the way Thorne ran, it was different. He did not coddle them. He did not lower his standards. He expected excellence and would not accept anything less. Rebecca Huang had failed spectacularly on the first attempt, and the second, and the third. Each time, Thorne had pulled her aside afterward, not to berate her, but to ask a single question. What did you learn? By the fourth attempt, she had stopped trying to be perfect. She had started trying to be better. And on the fifth attempt, she completed the exercise with the fastest time in her cohort. Thorne had found her afterward, standing alone outside the barracks, still not quite believing what she had done. He had looked at her with those winter sky eyes and said 5 words that she had carried with her for the rest of her career. You belong here, Lieutenant. Remember that. She had remembered. Through every deployment, every promotion, every moment of doubt, she had remembered. And when she pinned on her first star, she had gone to the memorial at Bragg and stood before the wall where his name was etched among the instructors who had shaped generations of warriors. She had assumed he was dead. The rumors after his retirement had been vague but dark. A wife who passed away. A man who vanished without a trace. She had tried to find him once, years ago, but the trail had gone cold. Eventually she had accepted that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. And now he stood before her in a county courthouse hallway, wearing handcuffs and a borrowed jacket, looking like the very definition of a man the world had forgotten. Master Sergeant, she said. Her voice came out strange, thick with emotions she had not expected to feel. Elias looked up. His eyes, dulled by years of grief and survival, suddenly sharpened. Recognition flickered across his face like lightning across a dark sky. Lieutenant Huang, he said slowly. The name emerged from somewhere deep, from a past that felt like another lifetime. You got your stars. I got my stars. Her voice cracked slightly on the words. Because of you. Saunders stood between them, his head swiveling back and forth, the magnitude of what was happening slowly dawning on him. This was not just any general. This was a 2-star deputy commanding general of Fort Liberty, one of the highest-ranking officers in the special operations community. And she was looking at the homeless man he had just handcuffed like he was a ghost returned from the dead. General, Saunders managed to say, you know this man. Know him. General Huang took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them. This man trained me. This man is the reason I stayed in the Army. She stopped directly in front of Elias, close enough to see the faded ribbons clutched in his cuffed hands, close enough to see the chain around his neck where dog tags and a wedding ring hung together. This man is Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, retired. Call sign Spectre. And he is one of the most decorated special operators in the history of Delta Force. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward in every direction. Fletcher stood at the end of the hallway, his mouth hanging open. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, had seen things that still woke him in the night, and he knew what Delta Force meant. The unit was legendary, the operators who filled its ranks the best of the best. To be called one of the most decorated in that unit's history was to be something beyond ordinary comprehension. Saunders looked down at the handcuffs on Elias's wrists, at the ribbons that Judge Whitmore had dismissed as garage sale finds, at the man who had stood in that courtroom and absorbed every insult without a word of defense. General, he said quietly, you need to see what just happened in there. There's a judge who accused this man of stolen valor, who added contempt charges when he would not remove his ribbons, who ordered me to confiscate them as evidence of fraud. General Huang's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. The transformation was instantaneous, the shift from stunned recognition to focused command presence. Her jaw set, her shoulders squared, and suddenly she was not just a woman encountering a ghost from her past. She was a general officer who had just learned that one of her own was being persecuted. Take those handcuffs off, she said. Her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. Saunders did not hesitate. He fumbled for his keys, hands shaking, and unlocked the restraints. They fell away from Elias's wrists, leaving red marks where the metal had pressed against skin. Elias stood motionless, the ribbons still clutched in his fingers. He looked at General Huang like a man who had woken from a long nightmare only to find that reality had become even stranger. "General," he said quietly, "you do not have to do this. I broke the law. I was trespassing. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I do not want special treatment because of who I used to be." "Who you used to be?" General Huang shook her head, something fierce burning in her eyes. "Master Sergeant, you are still that man. You will always be that man. And I will be damned if I let some small-town judge treat you like a criminal for wearing ribbons you bled to earn." She turned to Fletcher. "Get that courtroom door open. I'm going back in there. And I'm going to make sure everyone understands exactly who they have been dealing with." The courtroom had settled into an uneasy quiet. Judge Whitmore had moved on to the next case, a traffic violation that seemed almost absurd after the drama that had just unfolded. The defendant, a middle-aged woman caught running a red light, stood nervously before the bench while the judge droned through the charges with mechanical efficiency. But no one was really listening. The air in the room still crackled with the residue of what had happened. The young Marine veteran sat rigid in his seat, his eyes fixed on the side door through which Elias had been led. The stenographer typed without seeing her keys, her mind elsewhere entirely. Nina Castellanos had stopped recording but kept her phone ready, sensing that the story was not yet finished. The prosecutor, Allison Graves, shuffled papers on her table without purpose. Something about the previous case had unsettled her in ways she could not articulate. She had been doing this job for 15 years, had seen thousands of defendants pass through this courtroom, and she had learned to trust her instincts. Her instincts were telling her now that a terrible mistake had been made. Judge Whitmore was midway through sentencing the traffic violator when the main doors of the courtroom swung open with enough force to make them bang against the walls. Every head turned. Major General Rebecca Huang strode into the chamber like a force of nature. Her boot heels clicked against the floor with metronomic precision, each step echoing through the suddenly silent room. The two silver stars on her shoulders caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in sharp gleams. Her face was set in an expression that soldiers throughout Fort Liberty had learned to recognize as the precursor to someone's very bad day. Behind her came Bailiff Saunders, his own expression a mixture of vindication and barely contained fury. And behind him, walking with the quiet dignity that had never left him despite everything, came Elias Thorne. His wrists were bare now, the handcuffs gone, but the red marks they had left remained visible. Judge Whitmore's gavel froze in midair. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. In 24 years on the bench, no one had ever interrupted her proceedings like this. No one had ever dared. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" she demanded, her voice sharp but wavering slightly at the edges. "This is a court of law. You cannot simply barge in here and disrupt official proceedings." General Huang did not slow her approach. She walked directly to the front of the courtroom, past the traffic defendant who pressed herself against the railing to get out of the way, past the prosecutor's table where Graves sat frozen, past the public defender's station where Marcus Webb watched with wide eyes. She stopped directly before the bench, close enough that Judge Whitmore had to look down to meet her gaze. "Your Honor," General Huang said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room with the clarity of a person trained to command battalions. "My name is Major General Rebecca Huang. I am the Deputy Commanding General at Fort Liberty, and I am here because I have just learned that this court has committed a grave injustice against one of the most distinguished veterans in the history of the United States Army." Judge Whitmore's face cycled through several colors in rapid succession. Red with anger, white with shock, then a mottled combination of both. She gripped her gavel like a lifeline. "General," she said, struggling to maintain her composure, "I do not know what you have been told, but I assure you that this court has followed proper procedure. The defendant in question was found guilty of trespassing and held in contempt for refusing to comply with court orders. His alleged military service has no bearing on those charges." His alleged military service. General Huang repeated the words slowly, letting each syllable drip with contempt. She turned slightly, gesturing toward Elias, who had stopped near the gallery railing. That man is Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, retired after 28 years of service. He was a founding member of Delta Force. He served in operations that remain classified to this day. He has been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, and 2 Purple Hearts. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom like a shroud. Those ribbons you ordered him to remove, she continued, those ribbons you called garage sale fines, represent more sacrifice than most people can imagine in a lifetime. Each one was earned in blood. Each one carries the memory of brothers who did not come home. In the gallery, Nina Castellanos had her phone up again, recording everything. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She knew, with the certainty of a journalist who had stumbled onto the story of her career, that these images would be seen by millions. Judge Whitmore attempted to regain control. General, regardless of this man's service record, he broke the law. He was trespassing on private property. The sentence I imposed was within legal guidelines. General Huang's eyes narrowed. And the contempt charge, was that within guidelines as well? Punishing a man for refusing to remove medals he earned through decades of service to this country. He was disrupting court proceedings. He was standing silently while you mocked him. General Huang's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her controlled demeanor. I have spoken with Bailiff Saunders. I know exactly what happened in this courtroom. You accused a decorated combat veteran of stolen valor. You publicly humiliated him. You ordered the confiscation of his ribbons as evidence of fraud. She took a step closer to the bench, close enough that Judge Whitmore instinctively leaned back. Do you have any idea who you were speaking to? General Huang asked quietly. Do you have any concept of what this man has done for his country? He held a position for 11 hours under enemy fire to protect his extraction team. He has saved more lives than you will ever know. He trained an entire generation of special operators, including me. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the ancient air conditioning seemed to have stopped its rattling, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Judge Whitmore's hand trembled around her gavel. She looked past General Huang to where Elias stood, seeing him now through different eyes. The threadbare jacket, the worn boots, the gaunt frame. And beneath all of that, something she had failed to recognize. The bearing of a warrior. The quiet strength of a man who had faced death countless times and never flinched. For the first time in 24 years on the bench, Judge Constance Whitmore did not know what to say. The silence in the courtroom had become a living thing, pressing against the walls, filling every corner with its weight. Judge Whitmore sat frozen on her bench, her gavel still clutched in white-knuckled fingers, her carefully constructed authority crumbling around her like a sand castle before the tide. General Huang had not moved. She stood before the bench like a monument, her presence filling the space in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. Behind her, the gallery had transformed into a collection of statues, every person motionless, barely breathing, afraid that any sound might shatter the moment. Elias remained near the railing where he had stopped. The faded ribbons were still in his hand, pressed against his palm so tightly that he could feel the metal clasps digging into his skin. He watched the confrontation unfold with the detached calm of a man who had long ago stopped expecting anything from the world. But something was stirring inside him, something he had thought dead, buried alongside Marie and Desmond and all the other ghosts he carried. It felt almost like hope, though he was afraid to name it. Judge Whitmore finally found her voice. "General," she said, the word coming out thin and reedy, "even if everything you say is true, I cannot simply dismiss charges based on a defendant's military record. The law applies equally to everyone." "Does it?" General Huang tilted her head slightly, a predator examining prey that had just said something interesting. "Then perhaps you can explain why you added contempt charges for a man who did nothing but stand quietly while you insulted him. Perhaps you can explain why you ordered the confiscation of his medals without any evidence that they were fraudulent. Perhaps you can explain why you told a combat veteran that his service was a costume parade." Each question landed like a hammer blow. Judge Whitmore flinched at the final one, her face draining of color. In the gallery, the young Marine veteran had risen to his feet again. This time, no one told him to sit down. He stood at attention, his eyes fixed on Elias, his hand slowly rising toward his forehead in a salute that had nothing to do with regulation and everything to do with respect. One by one, others began to stand. An older man in the back row, Vietnam era by the look of him, his weathered face etched with recognition. A woman in a business suit who had been waiting for a civil matter, her hand pressed against her heart. The traffic defendant who had been interrupted mid-sentencing, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, though she could not have explained why. Even the prosecutor rose. Allison Graves stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, her eyes meeting Elias's across the room. She had sent men to prison for less than what he had supposedly done. She had built a career on following the letter of the law without questioning its spirit. And now she understood, perhaps for the first time, that sometimes the law was not enough. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. In light of this new information, the state moves to dismiss all charges against the defendant. With prejudice. Judge Whitmore stared at her prosecutor as if she had been betrayed. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." Graves squared her shoulders, finding courage she had not known she possessed. "What happened in this courtroom today was wrong. I will not be party to it any longer." The judge's mouth worked soundlessly. She looked around the room, searching for an ally, finding none. The stenographer had stopped pretending to type and sat with her hands in her lap, her eyes red-rimmed. The clerk had pushed back from his desk and was watching with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Even Bailiff Saunders, who had served her faithfully for 12 years, stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set in silent condemnation. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. General Huang spoke again, her voice softer now, but no less commanding. "Your Honor, I am not here to interfere with the judicial process. What you do with your courtroom is your affair. But I am here to ensure that the record reflects the truth. This man served his country with distinction for nearly 3 decades. He bled for it. He lost brothers for it. He watched his best friend die in his arms because he was half a second too slow on a shot that no one else could have made at all." She turned to look at Elias, and her expression shifted from cold fury to something gentler, something like grief. "And when his wife died," she continued, "when the woman who had been his anchor for 30 years was taken from him, he did what too many veterans do. He disappeared. He stopped believing he deserved help. He stopped believing he deserved to live." Elias closed his eyes. The words carved through him like knives, laying bare wounds he had spent 3 years trying to ignore. Marie's face swam before him in the darkness behind his eyelids. Her smile, her laugh, the way she used to say his name, all 3 parts of it when she was annoyed with him. "You stubborn fool," she would say. "You did not get to give up." But he had given up. That was the truth he could not escape. He had walked away from everything and everyone because the weight of loss had become too heavy to bear. General Huang's voice brought it back. "The Army has been looking for Master Sergeant Thorne for 3 years. Veterans organizations have been looking for him. People who owe him their lives have been looking for him. And today, by sheer chance, I walked into this courthouse and found him being led away in handcuffs by a judge who called his service a lie." She turned back to the bench, and her voice hardened once more. "So I am asking you, Your Honor, not as a general, not as a representative of the military, just as a human being who owes this man everything she has become. Dismiss the charges. Let him go, and spend the rest of your career remembering what you almost did here today." Judge Whitmore's gavel slipped from her fingers. It struck the bench with a hollow thud and rolled to the edge, teetering there for a moment before falling to the floor. The sound it made when it landed was small and final, like the closing of a door that could never be reopened. She stared at General Huang, then at the gallery full of people standing in silent witness, then at Elias Thorne, the man she had called a fraud, the man whose ribbons she had dismissed as costume jewelry, the man who had stood before her with quiet dignity while she tore him apart. Her hands began to tremble. She pressed them flat against the bench to hide it, but the movement was visible to everyone watching. "The charges," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. She cleared her throat and tried again. "The charges against the defendant are dismissed. With prejudice. The contempt finding is vacated." The words hung in the air, insufficient and too late. General Huang nodded once, a sharp movement that acknowledged the ruling without accepting it as any kind of victory. This was not about winning. This had never been about winning. It was about truth, and the truth had been dragged into the light whether the judge wanted it there or not. Elias had not moved. He stood at the gallery railing with the ribbons still pressed into his palm, his eyes distant, his mind processing what had just happened through layers of numbness that 3 years of survival had built. He was free. The word felt foreign, meaningless. He had been free before, free to wander, free to disappear, free to slowly fade away in doorways and under bridges. This was just another kind of freedom, and he did not know what to do with it. General Huang turned and walked toward him. Her boot heels no longer clicked with authority. They moved softly now, almost hesitantly, as she approached a man she had spent decades admiring from afar. She stopped in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she reached out and gently took the ribbons from his hand. He let them go without resistance, watching as she examined each one with the care of someone handling sacred relics. "I remember the day you earned this one," she said quietly, touching the Distinguished Service Cross ribbon. "It was still classified when I was at Bragg, but rumors spread. An 11-hour firefight, single-handedly holding a position so the extraction team could get out. They said you ran out of ammunition twice and still would not abandon your post." Elias said nothing. The memory was there, buried beneath years of other memories, other missions, other moments when death had brushed past him close enough to feel its breath. And this one, she touched, won the silver stars. "Grenada," she said. "Point Saline's airfield. You were 27 years old, and you led your team through an enemy position that intelligence said was impenetrable." "I had good men with me," Elias said softly. The words came automatically, the reflexive deflection of someone who had never been comfortable with praise. "You always say that." General Huang smiled, and for a moment she was not a 2-star general, but just Rebecca Huang, the young lieutenant who had once stood outside of barracks at Fort Bragg wondering if she belonged. "You always gave credit to everyone except yourself. Even back then." She carefully pinned the ribbons back onto his threadbare jacket, one by one, smoothing the fabric with fingers that trembled slightly. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at him. The jacket was worn nearly through in places. The shirt beneath it was missing buttons. His boots were held together with tape and hope. But with those ribbons on his chest, with that bearing in his shoulders, he looked like exactly what he was. A warrior, a legend, a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. In the gallery, the young Marine veteran was still standing at attention, his salute unwavering. Others had joined him now, the Vietnam veteran with tears streaming down his weathered face. Court Security Officer Fletcher, who had served in Afghanistan and understood what those ribbons meant. Even Bailiff Saunders had straightened to attention, his hand raised to his brow. Dorothy Chun, the stenographer, had abandoned her machine entirely. She stood with her hand pressed over her heart, her cheeks wet, her breath coming in small hitches that she did not try to hide. General Huang turned to face the room. Her voice carried with the clarity of command, but beneath it was something raw and human. "This man trained me," she said. "When I was ready to quit, when I thought I did not belong in uniform, he looked at me and told me 5 words that changed my life." She paused, her throat working. "You belong here, Lieutenant. Remember that." She looked back at Elias. "I remembered, Master Sergeant. Every single day, for 37 years, I remembered. And now I am telling you the same thing." She stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear what she said next. "You belong here," she whispered, "among people who care about you, among brothers and sisters who understand what you carry. You have been alone long enough, Elias. It is time to come home." Elias felt something crack inside his chest. A wall he had built brick by brick over 3 years of grief and guilt and endless wandering. It did not crumble all at once. But for the first time since Marie's death, for the first time since he had walked away from everything he knew, he felt the first fracture spread through its foundation. His eyes burned, his throat tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I do not know if I can," he said. "I do not know if I remember how." General Huang reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm and warm and real. "Then we will help you remember," she said. "That is what family does." The courtroom remained frozen in the aftermath of what had transpired. No one seemed to know what to do, how to move forward from a moment that had cracked open something fundamental about justice and judgment and the way society treats those it has forgotten. Judge Whitmore sat motionless on her bench. Her face had gone gray, the color of old ash, and her eyes stared at nothing. In 24 years, she had never lost control of her courtroom. She had never been challenged, never been exposed, never been forced to confront the possibility that her certainty might be cruelty in disguise. The gavel lay on the floor where it had fallen. She made no move to retrieve it. General Huang guided Elias toward the gallery gate, her hand still holding his. The touch was an anchor, something solid in a world that had suddenly become unstable. He walked beside her in a daze, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened. As they passed through the gate, the young Marine veteran stepped forward. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build and watchful eyes of someone who had seen combat. His salute had not wavered. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My name is Corporal James Okonkwo. I serve with 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. I just wanted to tell you, that it is an honor to be in the same room as you." Elias stopped. He looked at the young man, at the tattoo on his forearm, at the way he held himself despite whatever battles he was fighting in this courthouse today. "At ease," Corporal Elias said quietly. The words came from somewhere deep, from the instructor he had once been, the leader who had shaped hundreds of young warriors. "And thank you for your service." Okonkwo's composure cracked. His hand dropped from its salute, and he wiped quickly at his eyes, embarrassed by the tears he could not control. "Thank you for yours," he managed to say. One by one, others approached. The Vietnam veteran, whose name was Harold Washington, who had served 3 tours and come home to a country that spat on him. He gripped Elias's hand with both of his own and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The understanding between them transcended words. Court Security Officer Fletcher came forward and snapped to attention. "Sergeant First Class, retired," he said. "2 tours in Afghanistan. I heard about you when I was at Bragg. The stories they tell about Spectre." He shook his head slowly. "I never thought I would actually meet the legend." "I am no legend," Elias said. "Just an old man who stayed alive longer than he should have." "With respect, Master Sergeant," Fletcher replied, "that is not what the men who served under you would say." Even the prosecutor approached. Allison Graves walked slowly, her heels clicking against the floor, her expression a mixture of shame and something that might have been admiration. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I should have looked closer at your case. I should have questioned what was happening instead of just going through the motions." "You were doing your job," Elias replied. "I do not hold it against you." "Maybe you should." She met his eyes directly. "Maybe we all need to be held accountable for the jobs we do and the way we do them." She glanced back at Judge Whitmore, still sitting frozen on her bench, and something hardened in her expression. "I will be making a formal complaint to the Judicial Review Board," she said quietly. "What happened here today will not be swept under the rug." Nina Castellanos had moved closer, her phone still recording. She was a journalist, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that this story needed to be told. But she was also a human being, and she understood that some moments deserved reverence rather than exploitation. She lowered her phone and approached General Huang. "General," she said, "my name is Nina Castellanos. I am a freelance journalist. I have been recording these proceedings." She hesitated. "I would like permission to publish this footage. I think people need to see what happened here." General Huang looked at Elias. The decision was his to make. Elias considered for a long moment. He had spent 3 years invisible, anonymous, forgotten. The thought of being seen again truly seen was terrifying. But he thought about the other veterans out there, the ones sleeping under bridges and in doorways, the ones being dismissed and mocked and forgotten by a society that owed them everything. If it helps someone, he said finally, if one person sees this and thinks twice before judging a man by his clothes instead of his character, then yes, publish it. Nina nodded solemnly. I will make sure the story is told right, she promised. I will make sure people know who you are. Who I was, Elias corrected quietly. Who I was is not who I am now. General Huang squeezed his hand. Then we will help you figure out who you want to become, she said. Starting today. She turned to address the room one final time. Her voice carried the weight of command, but also something softer. Gratitude, perhaps. Or hope. What happened in this courtroom today should never have happened, she said. But it did. And now we have a choice. We can let it fade away, another forgotten injustice in a world full of them. Or we can use it. We can let it remind us that every person we pass on the street has a story. That the homeless man asking for change might have held a position under enemy fire for 11 hours. That the woman in worn clothes might have served her country with more distinction than we will ever know. She paused, letting her words settle. Master Sergeant Thorne spent 3 years alone because he believed he did not deserve help. He was wrong. And today, we are going to start proving it to him. She looked at Elias, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Welcome home, Master Sergeant, she said. It has been far too long. 6 months had passed since that day in the courtroom. Nina Castellanos' video had gone viral within hours of being posted. 6 million views in the first day. 40 million by the end of the week. The footage of Judge Whitmore demanding Elias remove his ribbons, calling them garage sale fines, played on news channels across the country. The image of General Huang pinning those same ribbons back onto his threadbare jacket became a symbol of something larger than one man's story. The Judicial Review Board had completed its investigation within 2 months. Judge Constance Whitmore chose early retirement rather than face formal censure. In her resignation letter, she wrote that she had lost sight of the humanity that justice was supposed to serve. Whether she truly believed those words or simply wanted to escape with her pension intact, no one could say. But that was not what mattered to Elias. What mattered was the small room at Fort Liberty where he now lived. For walls, a bed with clean sheets, a window that looked out over the parade ground where young soldiers trained in the morning light. It was not much by most standards. It was more than he had allowed himself to have in 3 years. General Huang had established a reintegration program specifically for homeless veterans with combat trauma. No paperwork beyond the basics. No bureaucratic mazes to navigate. Just a bed, 3 meals, counseling when you were ready, and people who understood what you carried without needing you to explain. Elias had resisted at first. Old habits ran deep, and the voice in his head that said he did not deserve help had not stopped whispering just because someone offered him kindness. But General Huang had been patient. She had been persistent, and eventually he had accepted. The therapy was hard. Harder than any mission he had ever run, any firefight he had ever survived. Sitting in a room with a counselor who asked him to talk about Desmond, about Marie, about all the things he had locked away, so he would not have to feel them. Some sessions he said nothing at all. Some sessions he could not stop talking once he started. But slowly, piece by piece, he was learning to carry the weight differently. Not to put it down, because some things could never be put down, but to shift it so that it did not crush him quite so completely. On this particular morning, he walked across the grounds toward the memorial wall outside Special Operations Command. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the air carried the crisp edge of early autumn. His boots no longer had tape holding them together. His jacket was new, a gift from the Veterans Organization that had rallied around him after the video spread. But the ribbons pinned to his chest were the same ones he had always worn, faded and frayed and irreplaceable. He stopped before the wall and found the name he was looking for. Corporal Desmond Achebe. The letters were etched in bronze, permanent and unchanging, surrounded by hundreds of other names of men and women who had given everything. Still here, brother, Elias said quietly. Still trying. He reached out and touched the letters, tracing them the way he had done 1,000 times before. But something was different now. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like drowning. It felt like remembering, like honoring, like carrying forward something precious instead of being crushed beneath its weight. General Huang found me. He continued. You would have liked her. She turned into one hell of a soldier, one hell of a leader, better than I ever was. He smiled slightly, and the expression felt less foreign than it had 6 months ago. She keeps telling me I need to start helping with the training programs. Says the young operators could learn something from an old ghost like me. I told her I am retired. She told me retirement is just a word. He was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind rustle through the trees that lined the Memorial Plaza. Marie would have liked her too, he said softly. Marie would have liked all of this. The room, the program, the people who keep showing up even when I try to push them away. His throat tightened, but he did not fight it. He had learned that fighting the grief only made it stronger. Better to let it move through him, to acknowledge it and then let it go. I still miss her, Des. Every single day. I still miss you both. But I'm starting to think that maybe surviving is not the same as betraying you. Maybe staying alive is how I honor what you gave. He stood there for a long time as the sun climbed higher and the base came to life around him. Soldiers jogging in formation. Officers heading to morning briefings. The everyday rhythm of military life continuing as it always had, as it always would. Eventually, he turned away from the wall and began walking back toward his quarters. There was a group session this afternoon, other veterans working through their own demons, and he had promised to attend. Not to speak, necessarily, just to be present, to show them that someone who had been where they were had found a way through. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And take a moment to think about the people you pass every day without really seeing. The man on the corner with the cardboard sign. The woman sleeping in the doorway. They all have stories. Some of those stories might be legendary. Elias Thorne had been lost for 3 years. Lost to grief, to guilt, to the crushing weight of everything he had seen and done and failed to do. But he had been found again. Not because he deserved it more than anyone else, but because someone had looked past the threadbare jacket and the worn boots and seen the man underneath. That was the lesson General Huang had taught him. The same lesson he had taught her nearly 4 decades ago, though he had not realized it at the time. You belong here. Remember that. He was beginning to remember. One day at a time, one breath at a time, one small act of living at a time. The road ahead was long and uncertain, and there would be days when the darkness closed in again. But for the first time in 3 years, Elias Thorne believed he might actually walk it. Not alone, never alone again. The morning sun warmed his face as he walked, and somewhere in the distance, he could almost hear Marie's voice, carried on the wind. There you are, she seemed to say. I knew you would find your way back. And finally, impossibly, Elias smiled.